What if that hyperactive kid you see, literally bouncing off the walls, or even that adult who just can't seem to sit still through a single meeting? What if their brain isn't actually overactive at all?
Right, which is what we all assume.
Exactly. What if, neurologically speaking, their brain is actually kind of fallen asleep on the job?
It sounds completely backward, I know.
It really does. But today, on this deep dive, we are going to radically shift how you understand attention deficit disorder, ADD, ADHD, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, we're moving way, way past those tired, honestly exhausted ideas about bad genes or bad parenting.
Totally. Instead, we're exploring how our insanely fast-paced, high-stress world actually physically shapes a developing human brain.
And our source material for this whole journey is this really foundational text called Scattered Minds. It's by Dr. Gabor Maté.
And what I love about this source is that the author isn't just some detached academic, right?
Not at all. I mean, yes, he's a physician, but he brings this incredible, profound authority because he's looking at it from the inside out.
Yeah, he was actually diagnosed with ADD himself.
Exactly, in his 50s. And all 3 of his kids have been diagnosed with it too.
Wow, all 3.
Yeah. And he traces it all back to his own deeply conflicted, super high-stress family history. So he's really bridging that gap between cold clinical neuroscience and real lived experience.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the central premise here just flips everything we think we know right on its head.
It really does.
Because the traditional medical model, it treats ADD like a fixed thing, right? Like an inherited pathology.
Yeah, like a permanent error in your genetic code. You're just born with it.
But the source material says no, it's actually an impairment of development. It's an arrest in development.
A physiological consequence of basically living in a particular environment, in a particular culture.
So whether you have ADD yourself, or maybe you have a kid who does, or honestly, if you just feel chronically overwhelmed and distracted by modern life, we are going to get into exactly why our brains feel so scattered.
And crucially, how we can actually resume the development we missed out on.
Yes. So to understand where that developmental arrest comes from, we first have to strip away all that sterile clinical language from the diagnostic manuals.
Oh, totally. The DSM criteria, poor attention, poor impulse control, hyperactivity, those are just the outside observations.
Just what other people see.
Right. It doesn't capture the internal chaos at all.
And the text gives these incredibly visceral, almost poetic descriptions of what that inner life actually feels like.
Yeah, the analogies are wild.
There was this one anecdote about a 47-year-old man in Dr. Maté's office, and he described his life as, quote, so much soup and garbage can.
It's such a striking phrase.
Isn't it? It just perfectly evokes that feeling of being discarded, or just being this messy accumulation of ingredients that never actually turn into anything cohesive.
And then there was another patient who talked about feeling like a human giraffe.
Oh, right, the giraffe thing.
Yeah, where he felt like his head was floating way up in this completely different atmosphere, just totally disconnected from his physical body down on the ground.
Which really paints a picture of a mind just desperately trying to manage this massive overload of disjointed input.
Well, and that disconnection is actually a fundamental coping mechanism, which we'll get into when we hit the neurology part.
Oh, definitely. But to visualize the day-to-day reality of that overload, I love the analogy the text uses of the Ed Sullivan Show juggler.
Yes.
Yeah.
The guy spinning the plates on the sticks.
Exactly. So he gets one plate spinning, gets it balanced, and then he has to start another one.
But then he keeps adding more sticks and more plates.
Right. And he's frantically running back and forth because the second he looks away from one plate, it starts to wobble.
He's using just this massive, unsustainable amount of energy, just trying to keep everything from crashing down.
But the real tragedy of the ADD mind is that, unlike that guy on TV, they can't ever stop the show.
No commercial breaks.
None. They are just locked in this perpetual motion machine of anxiety. They literally can't let any of the plates go.
And when you map the clinical traits of ADD onto that spinning plate chaos, the hyperactivity suddenly makes perfect sense.
Right. But we should clarify, hyperactivity isn't always physical.
Thank you. Yes. It's not always just the stereotypical little boy running laps around the classroom.
Especially for girls and women, right? Because they are often heavily socialized to hide those external behaviors.
Exactly. For them and for many adults, the hyperactivity is entirely internal.
Like an incessant mental white noise.
Yeah. A mind that's just constantly revving, flipping through channels, aggressively tuning out the physical present.
Okay, but I have to push back on a common assumption here. The label itself is attention deficit disorder, But we all know people with ADD who can sit and play a super complex video game or read a massive fantasy novel for like 6 hours straight.
Right, without looking away once.
Yeah, they aren't distracted at all. They are hyper-focused.
Yeah.
So how does a failure to pay attention in math class make sense when they can focus perfectly on a screen?
Well, what's really fascinating here is the neurobiological difference between active attention and passive attention.
Okay, active versus passive.
Right. ADD is highly situational. It's not an absolute inability to pay attention. It's actually a failure to regulate the motivational apparatus that you need for active attention.
Meaning things that take actual effort.
Exactly. Active attention requires immense metabolic energy from the brain. It's the conscious act of engaging with something that isn't instantly stimulating.
Like doing your taxes or organizing the garage.
Yes. The brain has to generate its own internal motivation to stay on that task.
Whereas passive attention is when the environment is doing all the heavy lifting for you.
Spot on. When you're playing a video game, the game's algorithms are specifically designed to feed you constant, unpredictable bursts of dopamine.
So the game is regulating your attention for you.
Right. Your mind is just cruising on autopilot. You aren't directing your focus has been captured.
Wow. So the ADD brain really struggles to engage unless there's this massive, immediate rush of personal interest.
Or conversely, a massive rush of panic.
Ah, yes. The night before the test panic?
Exactly. The adrenaline and cortisol from an impending deadline basically act as a surrogate for intrinsic motivation.
It spikes the neurochemical arousal that their brain just can't generate on its own.
Right, so hyper-focusing on a video game is actually driven by the exact same underlying deficit as staring blankly out the window during a boring meeting.
They both represent an inability to consciously direct attention without extreme outside stimulation.
You basically can't shift gears manually. You have to rely on a steep hill or a rocket booster to get moving.
That makes so much sense. And that inability to manually shift gears really cascades into what the text calls the tragicomedy of forgetfulness.
Oh, the stories about this are amazing.
They are. It really highlights the energetic costs of just existing in a world that requires a linear sequence of actions when your brain refuses to work linearly.
Right, like Mate's friend Brian.
Yes, Brian and his dog. So Brian has ADD, and he takes his dog for a walk every single day.
But the dog has learned the routine.
Exactly. The dog has figured out that when Brian puts his coat on and heads for the door, the dog should just stay laying down under the kitchen table.
Because he knows what's coming.
Right. The dog refuses to get up until Brian has left the house and then come back inside 3 separate times to grab his forgotten keys, his wallet, and his sunglasses.
The dog successfully learned this sequence from experience. But the ADD brain is still trapped in this fractured loop.
Or Maté himself. He's this highly educated medical professional. He packs his bags, gets to the Ben Gurion airport in Tel Aviv, and he's feeling so proud of himself for being on time.
Until he gets to the ticket counter.
Right. The agent looks at his ticket and tells him his flight is scheduled for a full 24 hours later.
He was a whole day early.
A whole day. And these stories are funny on the surface, but they reveal a really profound physiological deficit.
They really do. It's a brain struggling to orient itself in sequence and time.
And that failure to orient in time is a huge piece of this puzzle. The source material calls it time blindness or time illiteracy.
It's like the ADD mind operates with the time processing abilities of a toddler.
Yes. Because for a toddler, there are only 2 times, now and not now.
And not now basically feels like infinity.
Exactly. If you tell a 3-year-old they can have a cookie in 10 minutes, they burst into tears because 10 minutes is not now, which to them means never.
And the ADD brain kind of retains that immature processing of time, which leads to this persistent magical thinking.
Magical thinking.
Yeah, like if you don't have a structural understanding of how time actually passes, you unconsciously start to believe you can manipulate it with willpower.
Oh, like the absolute conviction that I can take a shower, answer 4 long emails, find my lost keys, and drive across town all in exactly 8 minutes.
Precisely. You just expect time to miraculously stretch out to fit whatever impulse grabs your attention right now.
Okay, so we're seeing all this behavioral chaos, but what is physically happening in the brain? Where is this breakdown actually occurring?
Overwhelmingly, the neurobiology points to the right prefrontal cortex.
That's the area right behind the forehead, right?
Yes, the gray matter right up front. Think of the prefrontal cortex as the executive CEO of the brain.
Okay, the CEO.
It's the command center. It handles impulse control, emotional regulation, social intelligence, and directing that active attention we talked about.
And the physical data on this is striking. I was reading about MRI scans showing that these specific structures in the right prefrontal areas are actually physically smaller in patients with ADD.
Yes, the structural volume is often reduced. But even beyond the physical size, you have to look at the electrical activity.
Right, the Edmonton study.
Exactly. Researchers at the University of Alberta used EEGs, which measure the electrical waves in the brain, and they looked at boys with ADD compared to a control group without it.
And when they were just resting, doing nothing, their brainwaves were basically the same.
Completely indistinguishable. But the divergence happens the exact second there is a cognitive demand.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, they asked the boys to do a directed task that required active attention, like reading something complex or tracing a pattern.
And for the kids without ADD, their brains showed a big increase in fast electrical waves.
Right, their brains essentially shifted into a higher gear to meet the challenge. But the boys with ADD showed the exact opposite response.
Their brains powered down.
Literally.
Oh.
The EEGs recorded excessive slow wave activity. Their prefrontal cortex became profoundly underactive just when it was supposed to speed up.
Which brings us to my favorite analogy in the whole text, Maté's traffic cop.
It's such a perfect way to explain it.
So picture a super busy, complicated city intersection. Lots of major roads converging. The prefrontal cortex is the traffic cop standing right in the middle of that intersection.
And his main job isn't making cars go, it's inhibition. It's making cars stop.
Right. He has to put his hand up to stop the northbound traffic, specifically so the eastbound traffic can get through safely. That inhibition creates order.
But in the ADD brain, that traffic cop is asleep on the job. There's absolute zero inhibition.
So all the cards, which are sensory input, random thoughts, physical impulses, huge emotions, they all just crash into the intersection at the exact same time.
Absolute gridlock.
Horns blaring, cars smashing together. It looks like chaotic movement, but it's actually total paralysis.
And understanding that biological reality is the key to unlocking the massive paradox of ADD medications.
Because the obvious question is, if the brain is underactive, if the cup is asleep, why are they literally bouncing off the walls?
Right. And more importantly, why would any sane doctor prescribe a central nervous system stimulant like Adderall or Ritalin to someone who is already hyperactive?
It sounds like throwing gasoline on a fire.
It does. But if we connect this back to how the brain works, we realize we totally misunderstand hyperactivity. The fidgeting, the racing thoughts, the outbursts. That's not a brain with too much energy.
It's a brain that has completely lost its brakes.
Exactly. The cortex is flooded with unfiltered noise because there's no inhibition. So when you take a stimulant, it doesn't tranquilize you.
It targets the prefrontal cortex with electrical arousal. It wakes up the traffic cop.
Yes. The medication arouses the inhibitory function of the CEO. The cop wakes up, blows his whistle, stops the random thoughts from crashing the intersection, and order is restored.
So the stimulant is actually an alarm clock, not a sedative.
Exactly. It provides the chemical arousal the brain chronically fails to make on its own.
Okay, but this brings us to a huge philosophical crossroads. If we're looking at smaller right prefrontal structures, slower brain waves, missing neurotransmitters, it's super easy to just throw our hands up and say, well, it's genetic destiny.
Right. They were born with bad wiring. It runs in the family, so it's a genetic disease. We hear that constantly.
We do. But the source material fiercely contests this. It basically wages war against this assumption.
Dr. Maté targets what he calls genetic fundamentalism. It's this cultural obsession with blaming every human behavior or psychiatric issue entirely on our DNA.
Right, like finding the gene for depression or the gene for being bad at math.
Yeah, and it's comforting, honestly. Blaming genes absolves society and parents and the individual from any real responsibility.
It turns all this complex human suffering into a simple mechanical glitch. But genes aren't these autonomous puppet masters pulling our strings.
No, genes are just architectural blueprints. They're totally inert. They just sit there coding for proteins. Whether those blueprints actually get used and how the building gets built is entirely up to the environment.
Now, to be fair, conditions like Huntington's disease really are purely genetic. If you have the mutation, you get the disease, period. So if ADD runs in families, why isn't it the same?
This is a crucial distinction. It's the difference between predetermination and predisposition. Huntington's is predetermined.
The DNA dictates the outcome perfectly.
Right. But a predisposition is just a vulnerability. It's a loaded gun, but the environment still has to pull the trigger.
And the text uses a really powerful example to illustrate this, looking at the Cree population in northwestern Canada.
Yeah, the diabetes epidemic among the Cree is the perfect lens for this.
So currently, the diabetes rate in the Cree Nation is like 5 times the Canadian national average.
And a genetic fundamentalist would look at that and say, wow, they have a terrible genetic defect causing diabetes.
But their genetics didn't spontaneously mutate over the last 50 years. What changed radically and violently was their environment.
Exactly. Their traditional way of life, which was highly active, deeply community-focused, eating wild game, was systematically dismantled.
They were forced into a sedentary lifestyle. Their diet was replaced with heavy processed foods.
And the cultural dislocation caused immense communal stress. So the genetic vulnerability to glucose issues was probably always there.
But it required a catastrophic shift in their physical and psychological environment to actually trigger the epidemic.
And the development of ADD operates on that exact same epigenetic principle.
And if you want proof of how heavily the environment weighs on ADD, look at the adoption statistics.
Oh, this stat is wild.
The source notes that the rate of adoption among ADD patients in clinics is estimated to be 8 to 16 times higher than in the general population.
It's a massive statistical anomaly.
It's huge, but traditional psychiatry loves to point to twin studies to say ADD is genetic. They find identical twins separated at birth who both have ADD, and they say, see, different environments, same genes, must be totally genetic.
Which is such a glaring methodological flaw, because they are completely ignoring the most critical environment in human development,
The womb.
the prenatal environment. Twins separated at birth did share an environment. They shared the mother's womb for 9 months, and they shared the profound physiological trauma of the separation itself.
Because if a pregnancy ends in adoption, the vast majority of the time that pregnancy was characterized by intense systemic stress.
Right, the birth mother might be dealing with severe poverty, a lack of support, teenage pregnancy, or just deep emotional anguish over having to give up her child.
And her endocrine system is just flooding her body with cortisol and adrenaline, and those hormones cross the placental barrier.
They directly bathe the developing nervous system of the fetuses. Before those twins even took their first breath, their brains were being shaped by a highly stressed, cortisol-drenched environment.
Right. Plus, there's this weird psychological fallacy that children raised in the exact same household somehow share the same environment.
Oh, that's completely untrue.
The story of the Gilmore brothers completely dismantles that idea. It's so tragic, but so clear.
Gary Gilmore and his brother Mikhail.
Right. So Gary Gilmore was this notorious double murderer executed in Utah in the late 70s. But his youngest brother, McCall, grew up to be this highly successful journalist.
You even wrote a memoir about it, right?
Yeah, shot in the heart. They shared the same parents, same genes, same family name. But McCall wrote that he felt like he was raised in an entirely different universe than Gary.
Because the temporal reality of their childhoods was totally different. The family environment isn't static.
Exactly. Gary's early years were defined by desperate poverty, constant moving, and horrific violence. The father was terribly abusive, just an atmosphere of perpetual terror.
But by the time Mikhail was born, 11 years later, everything had changed.
The father's violent rages had calmed down, they had some money, they weren't moving constantly.
Mikhail was exposed to a completely different psychological baseline. So the environment isn't the physical house you live in.
It's the emotional atmosphere, the state of the marriage, the acute stress levels of the parents during those critical windows of brain development.
So if there's no fixed ADD gene, what actually is being passed down in these families? Because it does cluster in families.
Right. What are they inheriting?
They aren't inheriting a disorder. What they inherit is a temperament of extreme hypersensitivity.
Hypersensitivity, like an emotional allergy.
Exactly like an allergy. If someone is highly allergic to bee venom and they get stung, their throat swells up, their blood pressure drops, they might go into anaphylaxis.
But if I get stung by that exact same bee, I just get an itchy red bump.
Right. The bee didn't change. The venom didn't cause the crisis on its own. The life-threatening crisis was caused by the allergic person's hyperreactive immune response to a normal stimulus.
So the kid who eventually develops ADD is basically born with the neurological equivalent of an emotional allergy. They react so intensely to everything.
The source material uses this really visceral metaphor of having thin skin. Imagine someone with a severe scald burn. Their outer skin is gone, the raw nerve endings are totally exposed to the air.
Ouch.
Right. Now, to someone with healthy skin, a gentle summer breeze feels great. But to the person with a scald burn, that exact same gentle breeze causes blinding agony.
So if we translate that into a family dynamic, a dad comes home from work, he's tired, a little stressed. He tells his 8-year-old daughter, hey, hurry up, get your shoes on, we're late.
And maybe he just has a slight edge of impatience in his voice.
To a neurotypical kid with thicker emotional skin that barely registers, they just think dad's grumpy today and they grab the shoes.
But to the hypersensitive child, that minor edge of tension hits those exposed emotional nerve endings directly.
Their brain translates that slight frustration as a massive existential threat. They feel aggressively attacked.
So they react with genuine terror. They might burst into tears and scream, "Why are you always yelling at me?"
And the dad is totally confused. He's like, I'm not yelling. Because technically, volume-wise, he isn't.
But in the emotional currency of that kid's nervous system, he is absolutely deafening. The kid isn't manipulating him.
They're registering the subliminal emotional frequency of the room at a volume that normal brains just automatically filter out.
And there's real, hard biological evidence for this inborn sensitivity. You mentioned the University of Washington study.
Yes. Connecting the brainstem to the heart, lungs, and gut. It regulates our stress response.
And researchers looked at the baseline vagal tone in babies who were only 5 months old.
And they found that infants born with a naturally higher vagal tone were measurably more emotionally reactive to their environment.
They were just biologically wired to feel things more intensely.
But the wild part is the follow-up. They checked back when those babies were 14 months old. The ones with high vagal tone at 5 months were way more distressed by episodes of maternal separation later on.
Their nervous systems were just calibrated to detect shifts in the psychological atmosphere far more sharply.
They're like highly tuned seismic sensors. They feel the tremors way before the earthquake actually hits.
But that makes them sound so fragile, almost defective. Which begs the question, if being that sensitive makes an infant so vulnerable to stress that their brain development gets derailed, why didn't evolution just weed that out a million years ago?
Right. Why keep the sensitive genes around?
Because if we look at the big picture of human evolution, sensitivity isn't a defect at all. It's an immense advantage.
The tribe actually needs them.
Desperately, under healthy, supportive conditions, these emotionally allergic, perceptive kids grow up to be the artists, the shamans, the innovators, the empaths.
The ones who sense the subtle shifts in the weather or detect social tension before it becomes violent.
It's a profound biological gift. It only becomes a disorder when that beautifully tuned radar is completely overwhelmed by the frantic, chronically stressed modern world.
You're basically taking a finely tuned Formula One race car, forcing it to drive down a pothole-filled dirt road, and then diagnosing the car with a mechanical disease when the suspension snaps.
The car isn't broken. The environment is just hostile to its design.
Okay, so we have this highly sensitive infant born into an invisible sea of modern stress. How does that stress actually get inside their skull to miswire the prefrontal cortex?
To understand that, we have to look at how uniquely vulnerable a human baby really is. Compared to almost any other mammal, humans are born astonishingly premature.
Right. A baby horse literally drops out of the womb and is walking around in an hour.
A baby chimp can cling to its mother's fur almost immediately. But a human baby is entirely helpless. They can't even hold their own head up.
So why are we evicted from the womb so early?
It's the brutal evolutionary trade-off for walking on 2 legs. Bipedalism meant human pelvises had to get much narrower. But at the same time, our frontal lobes were expanding massively.
So if a human fetus stayed in the womb until its brain was as mature as a newborn chimp's, the skull would be way too big to fit through the birth canal.
Exactly. Mother and infant would both die. So we're born half-baked.
At birth, the human brain is only about 25% of its final adult size.
Meaning the vast majority of our neurological growth, wiring synapses, building the self-regulation centers in the prefrontal cortex, all of that has to happen outside the physical protection of the womb.
Fully exposed to whatever environment they happen to be born into.
There's actually a term for this by the anthropologist Ashley Montague, extrogestation.
Extrogestation.
Basically, the first 9 to 10 months after birth are functionally a second pregnancy, just happening on the outside.
So the infant's nervous system needs an environment that is just as secure and chemically regulated as the amniotic fluid, so the brain can finish building itself.
And the rule governing that construction is known as neural Darwinism.
Survival of the fittest synapses.
Precisely. The infant brain massively overproduces connections early on, trillions of them. But there's a ruthless pruning process.
Use it or lose it.
The synapses that are constantly stimulated by the environment survive and become permanent. The ones that get neglected literally wither and die.
The book uses a really stark example of this with human vision. Imagine a perfectly healthy newborn, genetically perfect eyes, flawless optic nerves.
But you put them in a pitch-black room for the first 5 years of their life.
They go completely, permanently blind.
The visual circuits in the brain literally atrophy because they require the environmental stimulus of light to survive.
Without light, the architecture for vision just degrades. And you can't just take a 6-year-old out of that dark room and expect them to see.
Right. The genetic blueprint was there, but the environment didn't provide the materials to build it.
And this exact same imperative applies to the emotional centers of the brain. The prefrontal circuits for impulse control, empathy, active attention, they need specific emotional stimuli to survive.
If the right emotional environment is missing, those vital self-regulation circuits go blind, essentially.
So if photons of light are what the visual cortex needs, what is the emotional equivalent of light? What does the prefrontal cortex need to not go emotionally blind?
It needs a very specific psychological and physiological process called attunement.
Let's dig into attunement, because I think people really misunderstand this. Attunement is not just loving your kid.
No, not at all. It's not about providing a nice house or organic food or expensive toys. You can deeply love your child and completely fail to attune to them.
Right. Attunement is this profound moment-to-moment emotional resonance. It's the parent actively sharing the infant's internal emotional state.
It's reading their subtle cues, matching their energy, and regulating their nervous system through this synchronized dance.
It's that feeling of being deeply understood. And to show how intensely a baby relies on that resonance, look at the double TV experiment.
Oh, this study is heartbreaking, but so fascinating.
Listeners, picture this. A mother is in one room, the baby is in another, and they're interacting through live TV monitors. They can see and hear each other perfectly in real time.
The mom smiles, the baby smiles. The baby waves, the mom laughs. They are perfectly in sync.
The baby is relaxed and happy. But then the researchers secretly change the video feed going to the baby.
Instead of the live feed, they play a recording of the mom from just 2 minutes earlier.
So on the screen, the mom still looks perfectly happy. She's still smiling and cooing.
But because it's a tape, her reactions are no longer synchronized with what the infant is doing right in that exact millisecond.
If the baby looks away, the taped mom keeps smiling. If the baby frowns, the taped mom laughs.
And the infant's reaction is immediate. They become profoundly distressed. They whimper, they look away, and eventually they just completely shut down.
Because even at a few months old, their nervous system can tell the difference between a staged display of happiness and true synchronized emotional sharing.
They need to feel that the parent's internal state is dynamically aligned with their own.
And this communication is happening totally non-verbally, directly from the mom's right brain to the baby's right brain.
Mostly through things you can't fake, like pupil dilation.
Oh, right. The autonomic nervous system controls that.
When a mom looks at her baby with genuine delight, her pupils dilate. The baby's right brain sees that tiny change, and the baby's own pupils dilate in response.
It's a closed-loop physiological circuit of connection. So where does all this dense attunement data actually go in the brain?
It goes right to a specific part of the prefrontal cortex called the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC, right behind the eyes.
The chief operating officer of emotional regulation.
Exactly. It manages interpersonal relationships and emotional weather. And the OFC literally records the emotional footprints of infancy.
Based on the Hebbian principle, neurons that fire together wire together.
Exactly. If an infant constantly experiences joyful attunement, the neural pathways for secure attachment wire together permanently.
But if they constantly face a stressed, distracted, or absent parent, the neurons fire in response to stress and wire together into circuits of anxiety.
The OFC encodes early stress as the baseline reality of the entire universe.
Which perfectly explains why, 30 years later, if a coworker makes a minor critical comment, that person's brain defaults instantly to infant-level panic.
They overreact because their OFC was programmed during extragestation to see the world as a threatening, unresponsive place.
Now, I really want to focus on the chemistry here, because we established that ADD is an underactive prefrontal cortex, largely due to a lack of dopamine.
Hence the stimulant medications.
Right, so the obvious question is, if the dopamine tank is empty, why can't we just fix it permanently with a pill? Just fill the tank and cure it.
It's such a seductive idea, but it's dangerously oversimplified. Modern psychiatry leans way too heavily on the biochemical model.
It's like depression is just a lack of serotonin.
Right. But what we're learning is that neurochemistry is an effect of the environment just as much as it's a cause of behavior.
How does the environment actually alter the chemistry?
Well, joyful attunement literally triggers the infant's brain to release endorphins and dopamine.
So when mom looks deeply into the baby's eyes with delight, that causes a dopamine cascade.
And the dopamine does more than just make the baby feel good. It physically stimulates the growth of new nerve endings and blood vessels in the OFC.
And most importantly, it stimulates the physical growth of the dopamine receptors.
Yes, the hardware. If that attunement is missing, the brain literally fails to build enough dopamine receptors.
So you can flood the brain with all the synthetic Adderall dopamine in the world, but if the physical architecture isn't there to hold it, it doesn't solve the core issue.
You can't just supplement the chemical. You need the relational experiences to build the architecture to hold the chemical.
It's staggering. It completely reframes the condition. Maté even suggests ADD shouldn't be attention deficit disorder, it should be attunement deficit disorder.
It's a far more precise description of what's actually happening.
But this forces us to look at a deeply uncomfortable reality. If attunement is failing so massively and ADD diagnoses are skyrocketing everywhere, why is this happening in perfectly normal, loving, middle-class homes?
Right. We understand how trauma or abuse derails brain development, but we're talking about families that look perfect on paper.
To answer this, Dr. Maté bravely turns the lens on his own family life.
He's remarkably vulnerable about this.
He is, because on paper, his family is the picture of success. He's a respected doctor, married to his wife Ray for over 30 years. No abuse, no hidden addictions, no financial ruin.
They deeply loved their 3 kids, and yet all 3 kids got ADD. Why?
Because the love a parent feels internally doesn't automatically translate into love experienced neurologically by the infant if the parent is totally consumed by stress.
Exactly. Maté describes his own life back then as a kamikaze lifestyle.
Frantic, unsustainable output, running a palliative care ward, delivering babies, seeing private patients, and writing a weekly newspaper column.
He admitted he wore his medical pager on his belt like a badge of honor, secretly hoping it would go off in public to show everyone how indispensable he was.
Total workaholism driven by severe anxiety. He was physically in the house sometimes, but emotionally, his prefrontal cortex was entirely elsewhere.
He talks about his weekend despair, the Saturday morning crash.
When the adrenaline of the work week wore off, his nervous system just collapsed. He'd hide behind the newspaper, vibrating with suppressed anxiety, emotionally totally vacant.
Leaving his wife Ray to shoulder everything, she became so overwhelmed she fell into a severe clinical depression.
And you have to look at this through the lens of the infant. The infant doesn't know dad is working 80 hours a week to provide for the family.
The infant only experiences the emotional absence. They experience the parenting they receive, not the parenting the adult intends to give.
That is such an important distinction. An infant's vagus nerve radar easily detects the mom's hidden depression or the dad's distracted pager-checking energy.
And the infant's brain interprets that lack of attunement as, I am not worthy of their attention. The universe is cold and unresponsive.
So the OFC wires itself for chronic anxiety. The child learns that being present is painful because the present reality is emotionally barren.
So the brain protects itself by scattering its attention, by dissociating.
The attention deficit is actually a highly successful hardwired coping mechanism to survive an empty environment.
And to really show how deeply the world penetrates the brain, Maté takes us back to the ultimate example of environmental stress from his own life.
Budapest, Hungary, 1944.
He traces his own ADD and workaholism right back to the darkest chapter of modern history.
Dr. Maté was born in January 1944. 2 months later, the Nazis fully occupied Hungary. Adolf Eichmann arrived to orchestrate the mass extermination of the Jewish population.
That was the baseline environment his brain was thrust into. Absolute suffocating terror.
And there's a photograph of him at 4 months old, held by his mother, who is wearing the mandatory yellow Star of David.
And if you look at the infant's face, he doesn't look like a normal baby.
Not at all. He looks incredibly tense. He has this hyper-vigilant, world-weary stare, like he's looking straight at some incomprehensible horror.
He's physically manifesting the terror of his mother's environment. She actually kept a diary during this time.
And the juxtaposition in the diary is just shattering. She writes with such tender maternal love, noting his black hair, laughing about how he peed in his own face during a diaper change.
But then, interspersed with that, the stark reality. Her husband is in a forced labor camp breaking rocks. They are marked for death, Millions are being massacred around them.
She confesses her agonizing terror that her newborn won't even live to grow up.
So how could she possibly provide calm, joyful attunement?
It's physiologically impossible. Her cortisol levels must have been astronomical.
And remember the double TV experiment. Little Gabor's infant brain, his developing OFC, was absolutely bathed in his mother's terror and grief.
His brain was literally formatted by the Holocaust.
Yes, the infant brain just wants to survive. And how do you survive an emotional environment vibrating with a terror far too immense to process?
You tune out. You disconnect your consciousness from the present moment because the present is utterly intolerable.
The brain wires itself to dissociate. That extreme historical example proves the whole thesis. ADD isn't a random genetic glitch.
The history of the world, societal structure, family stress, it all directly formats the neural circuitry of attention. The infant brain just converts the emotional atmosphere into physical brain tissue.
It's a total paradigm shift. It takes the blame completely off the child, and crucially, it removes the deliberate guilt from the parents, placing the responsibility on the broader environment.
Let's synthesize this journey we've been on. We went from the daily chaos of the ADD mind, the misplaced keys, the internal noise, to seeing it as a measurable reality of an underactive prefrontal cortex.
The sleeping traffic cop. We dismantled the myth of genetic destiny. We saw how sensitivity is inherited, but the disorder is formed by the environment.
We followed that sensitive infant through extragestation, realizing the brain needs the light of attunement to build the physical architecture for self-regulation and dopamine.
When parents are overwhelmed by modern capitalism or historical trauma, attunement breaks down, and the infant's brain adapts by tuning out.
But this developmental model holds an incredibly empowering truth. Because it's not a fixed disease like Huntington's, it means the brain can still grow.
Neuroplasticity.
No.
The brain remains plastic our entire lives.
Adults and children can heal, not just by masking symptoms with pills, but by intentionally creating the secure, attuned environments they missed out on, allowing those dormant neural pathways to finally connect.
The implications for therapy, education, and the workplace are massive.
Which forces us back to where we started. We wanted a simple, broken bone to put in a cast, but our brains are living records of the environments that shaped us.
And that leaves us with one final, very provocative thought.
If ADD is a result of a sensitive brain reacting defensively to a frantic, emotionally stressed environment, and ADD diagnoses are skyrocketing globally,
What does that tell us about the hidden emotional environment of our entire modern culture?
are we engineering a society that is fundamentally hostile to human development? Are we all collectively losing our capacity to attune to one another?
That's a heavy question.
It really is. Something to seriously mull over the next time you find yourself staring at a screen, completely overwhelmed and running late. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of scattered minds.